How does the Albanian Mafia maintain its power and stay successful? Over the course of this video series, we've covered how Albanian organised criminals have established themselves among the main players of European transnational organised crime. In this episode, we'll take a look at the ways in which they attempt to maintain their status as high-level players. So we'll be looking at the ways in which they operate and what tactics they employ, including their use of violence, how they launder their money so they can enjoy the proceeds of their crime, and how they sow corruption both back home in Albania and wherever they operate. So let's start with their use of violence. So for organised crime networks whose businesses are composed of illegal activities, the use of violence is an essential tool of the trade. Not only do you need to project strength, but if someone breaks the established rules or tries to rip you off, there isn't a trading standards agency you can report people to, and you can't go to the police. Instead, you have to enforce the rules yourself. And to do this, you need to employ violence, or the threat of violence and intimidation. At the same time, however, high-profile violence is a surefire way to attract the attention of law enforcement, which is bad for business. So to be successful, organised crime groups need to strike the right balance in order to do what's best for business. Now, West Balkan groups, and especially Albanian-speaking groups, appear to have been very successful in this regard. Open source reporting often makes mention of their reputation for extreme violence. At the same time, while there are occasional incidents of Albanian criminals being assassinated or found dead, for the most part, high-profile violence doesn't crop up too much when covering Albanian-speaking groups. So how do Albanian groups maintain this reputation for violence while continuing to operate fairly under the radar? Now, by and large, most reporting on Albanian-speaking organised crime maintains that they have the necessary fear factor to be successful. At the same time, though, Albanian groups are reportedly very professional and businesslike, as well as being quite cautious and careful in the way in which they operate. We've mentioned in previous episodes how their approach to new or rival groups is charismatic and open to cooperation and generally happy to work together, with the undertone that if things were to turn violent, then it would not be the Albanian group who were to suffer the most. Examples and incidents of violence against rival organised crime groups, so outside of the Albanian network, are fairly rare. This usually occurs when someone has wronged them in some way, for example, attempting to rob them or tax their cannabis plantations. And we've mentioned how there isn't, generally speaking, the classic turf war between these groups. That's not to say that they are not carrying out acts of violence, though. It could be that when they do carry out violence against these groups, they're able to do so in a manner which avoids attracting the attention of law enforcement or the media. For example, simply by making people disappear.
If you cross them, they're going to use violence. Kidnapping, taken away and not to be returned again, they'll just make you disappear.
And this could be a way to maintain their reputation for violence among the criminal community without attracting the attention of the police, which, as we mentioned, would be bad for business. Now, some reports suggest that Albanian-speaking groups were particularly violent in their early days of operation, therefore establishing their reputation. Now, once they've achieved this reputation, it's suggested that they are no longer quite so quick to use such extreme violence and instead use it more strategically. So in the EMCDDA's EU drug market report on cocaine for 2022, it mentioned that West Balkan groups seem to use violence in a somewhat strategic and controlled way, primarily to maintain their credibility as a threat. When violence is used, however, reporting suggests that they are quick to escalate quite quickly to extreme violence. You have to remember that, going back to the first episode of this series, that many Albanian organised crime networks are composed of people who either came up through the armed services or the secret services in the 1990s, or came of age in a period of particularly extreme violence back in Albania and during the wars in Yugoslavia. So a lot of these criminal networks will be made up of people who are particularly hardened to the use of violence and also trained and capable in the use of violence.
Albanian mafia groups have a reputation of being brutally violent, so intimidation can actually help avoid conflict, sometimes at least. Internal discipline is also ensured through threats of violence against the members' families back in Albania, which can also help avoid conflict in some cases. However, Albanian groups have been very violent, and their increased involvement in the cocaine trade has led to more violent incidents, including shootings, murders, kidnappings, intimidation, and torture. In Greece, since the end of last year, there has been a series of shootings connected to Albanian gangs, with almost one murder every month. It is believed that there is an ongoing war between groups within the Albanian network, fighting over the distribution of profits from drug trafficking and protection rackets. It is estimated that between 15 and 20 Albanian professional hitmen have been mobilized to Greece to take part in the war.
Now, according to a Balkan Insight report, former Director General of the Albanian Police Force, Ahmet Prenci, is quoted as saying that the country's feuding criminals based abroad are choosing to settle scores at home because they know that criminal investigations will not be as thorough as they would be on the European continent. So let's take a look at an example of this and how a dispute over a cocaine shipment in Europe led to the kidnapping and murder of a man in Albania. So Jan Prenger, a furniture salesman based in Albania with no criminal history or involvement in criminality, paid the ultimate price for an indiscretion that his brother made thousands of kilometers away in Europe. So in January 2020, a shipping container containing a consignment of cocaine was unloaded in the port of Portsmouth in England and taken away by a group of Albanian criminals who had been contracted to remove the cocaine from the port. Now, among these was Jan Prenger's younger brother, Astrid Prenger. Now, instead of delivering the cocaine to their client, they decided to hold on to it, believing that they were being shortchanged. Now, one of Jan Prenger's other brothers, Ndrek Prenger, was also involved in organised crime and was serving time in a UK prison. Within this prison, he received a call on a mobile phone that he had smuggled illicitly into the prison. And at the other end of the call was Dritan Rejepi, who, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, was the leader of the Compania Bello cocaine trafficking network, who himself was locked up in a prison cell in Ecuador. Now, it transpired that it was his cocaine that had been stolen, and he instructed Indrek to tell his brother Astrid not to touch it, and in fact to return it. Now, shortly after this phone call, on the streets of Albania, Jan Prenger was snatched by 4 masked men and bundled into the back of a white Range Rover. So Indrek was informed that his brother would be released when the consignment of cocaine was returned. However, despite returning more than half the cocaine and a cash sum which covered the rest of the shipment, Jan was not returned. In fact, it transpired that he had been killed during the kidnapping, possibly as a result of injuries he had sustained when being snatched off the street. And reportedly, Dritan Rejepi phoned up Indrek Prenger and gave him the names of the people who he had contracted to kidnap his brother in order for him to organise his own retribution should he want to, under the canon. And that's another point that crops up in reporting on Albanian organised crime, is the tying in of the canon to the supposed extreme violence that Albanian groups are willing to use. Now, press coverage mentions the canon quite frequently, possibly as a way of demonstrating the supposedly uniquely bloodthirsty nature of Albanian groups. But how does it actually tie into organised crime? As we've mentioned, the use of violence and kidnapping is fairly routine in the world of organised crime. It's likely that the canon is actually a means to an end, a way of justifying some of the crimes that these Albanian groups are carrying out back in Albania, for instance, targeting people's family rather than committing direct retribution against them in Europe. And there are some reports that suggest this is the case, that organised crime groups invoke the canon as an excuse for targeting people's family members. And in fact, organised crime groups are generally reluctant to get into business with other groups that are currently involved in active feuds because it's bad for business. However, there are reports that some Albanian crime families are involved in blood feuds with each other, that sometimes spill over into Europe as well. So this would appear to be the case with an Albanian man who was assassinated outside his home in the port city of Antwerp in Belgium, who, despite his involvement in the cocaine trade, may have been murdered because of an ongoing family feud back in Albania rather than anything related to his activities in drug trafficking. So in fact, his murder may have been related to the Chapia crime family, who are based in Elbasan in Albania. Now, the Chapia family are reportedly involved in a blood feud that dates back to 2005. So Ardian Chapia, a local crime boss who owns a hotel in Elbasan and is reportedly involved in the cocaine trade. His brother, now Sokol Chapia, was murdered in 2005, and this sparked a series of tit-for-tat killings and attempted assassinations that continues to the present day. And this brings us to January 2022. So Bledar Mucha, who is the right-hand man, or was the right-hand man, of Florence Chapia, he was shot dead in a killing that has all the hallmarks of a contract killing in Antwerp. So while an assassination in Antwerp, which is one of the hubs or central hubs of cocaine trafficking in Europe and experiences quite high levels of violence associated with the drugs trade, this may not necessarily have been related to Albanian organised crime and its activities in the European cocaine trade. Instead, it may have been a spillover of a series of spiralling violence involving Albanian crime families that has spread onto the European continent. But while criminality has flowed from Albania into Europe and violence associated with that criminality has then flowed back to Albania, so too has a large amount of dirty money earned on the continent. So, like any organised crime network operating in Europe, Albanian criminals launder their money in Europe too. This could be in form of real estate, such as hotels, restaurants, casinos, car washes in the UK frequently crop up in reporting. However, for the most part, Albania is the place where Albanian organised crime gangs choose to launder their money. So Albania as a country has been assessed to be vulnerable to illicit financial flows. The Basel Index against money laundering ranks Albania 74th out of 128 countries when it comes to money laundering. Reportedly, for every 100 euros that is legally invested in the Albanian economy, a further 80 euros comes from unaccounted sources, potentially organised crime. And only 60% of economic activity in the country is from the formal economy, making it a prime location for carrying out money laundering. So often reports suggest that in the UK, cash is removed from the country as quickly as possible as a matter of priority, often to the Netherlands. From there, it then makes its way back to Albania, either through cash smuggling, through hiring people to carry just under the maximum legal amount and spread out across several different couriers, or through wire transfers. Other money laundering tactics involve investing in luxury goods such as high-end vehicles, which are then transported back to Albania. And reportedly, so much property is being built in Albania using illicit money that it's fueling a property boom in the country, and also causing a spiraling of property prices that are out of touch of the actual economic reality of everyday Albanians living in places such as Tirana, for example. So properties such as apartment complexes, hotels and tourist resorts are being built using money earned through organised crime in Europe. And it's not just Albanian criminals who are involved in this in the country. Reportedly, members of the 'Ndrangheta, the richest Italian mafia, who, again, as we've mentioned repeatedly throughout this video series, have close ties with the Albanian Mafia, are investing their money in the country. So 'Ndrangheta members have been caught on wiretaps discussing their investments in the country. So wiretaps made public in Albania by a local media network, RTV Ora, revealed that members of the 'Ndrangheta bribed senior officials in Albania to obtain building permits and concessions in order to launder money. Now, these members of the Ndrangheta were going to invest their money into construction and the health industry. As well as groups such as the Ndrangheta, apparently Mexican cartels are also laundering money in Albania. Get in-depth insight on the activities of Albanian organised crime. Transnational organised crime is one of the biggest threats to security in Europe today, and the Albanian Mafia is one of the most significant organised crime groups on the continent. Using open source reporting and data from the Intelligence Fusion Threat Intelligence platform, we'll be releasing a comprehensive report on the state of Albanian organised crime groups and their impact on global security. Sign up now to receive the report as soon as it's released. Click the link in the description below. So reports in the Mexican media quoted Mexican intelligence sources, which stated that the Sinaloa cartel were working with members of the Albanian Mafia to launder their money through tourist resorts that they owned both in Latin America and in Albania. So the same report also cites sources from Mexican intelligence who state that the Jalisco New Generation cartel are also working with Albanian organised crime for money laundering purposes. Both cartels are reported to have established links with Albanian organised crime gangs, investing their money through the tourism industry in Albania, building tourist resorts, or through the gambling industry in the country. This is reportedly led by the Launder brothers, who are Albanian nationals who are also based in Mexico itself and own a number of properties in the country. Now, this wouldn't be anything new for Albanian organised crime gangs. In fact, one of the ways in which Albanian criminals have built relationships with Latin American cartels is through offering money laundering services. So Dritan Rajepi, for example, reportedly first established contacts with Latin American cartels by providing them with money transfer services. Now, these reportedly significantly undercut the Chinese organizations who were providing money services at the time. This involved using cash couriers based in Ecuador, as well as a series of wire transfers using the Western Union service. The company Bello, which, as we mentioned, Dritan Rajepi is the head of, also uses something called the Phi Chien system, which is similar to the Hawala system. So this is an informal value transfer system, which involves criminals in one country paying money into a centralized money transfer organization, who then contacts another member of their organization in a separate country, who then withdraw an equivalent amount and pay it to the intended recipient. So there's no actual money exchanged between the two parts of that deal. Instead, they use a separate service which provides the equivalent value. Now, in June 2022, the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering body, Moneyval, actually assessed an improvement in Albania, but it's not just Albania where Albanian organised crime groups launder their money. Although for the most part they do, they're also involved in money laundering across Europe. So a criminal network taken down in February 2022, for example, had set up a string of enterprises across Spain, Western Europe and Croatia. Now, the alleged leader of the group is a man by the name of Bashkin Osmani. He owned several properties in Spain, including restaurants and a mansion in Majorca, hotel in Croatia, which is where he was arrested, and the Osmani clan in general have significant business interests in Hamburg. Now, Osmani allegedly hosted events in Majorca, which allowed members of different European organised crime organisations to sit down and meet face to face. Increasingly, though, criminals are keeping their money in the UAE. So according to the Global Initiative Against Organised Crime, around 2/3 of high-level Albanian criminals are based in Dubai. The report states that by investing money in the country through, for example, real estate, the Emirati authorities look the other way to their criminal activities in Europe. And the only rule is not to engage in criminality in that country. The UAE itself has long been a so-called safe haven for high-level organised criminal actors. There are several news reports which quote anonymous European law enforcement officials expressing frustration at a lack of cooperation from authorities in the UAE. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for example, in 2020 published a long report on the UAE as a destination for criminal enterprises, in which they said that Emirati leaders appear to lack the political will and relevant training to truly partner with foreign law enforcement. And in March 2022, following an influx of Russian money, the Financial Action Task Force placed Dubai on the grey list, which means its financial institutions were being monitored to improve their anti-money laundering operations. There are also reports from around 2019 that Albanian organised crime groups were investing in cryptocurrency as a form of money laundering, and Bashkim Osmani, when he was arrested, allegedly had around 40,000 euros in crypto to his name. However, for the most part, Albanian organised crime groups are described as being fairly unimaginative when it comes to laundering their money, and they prefer to invest in tangible goods such as real estate, for example. So one reason why Albania is such a key destination for Albanian organised crime groups to carry out both money laundering and significant levels of violence is the embedded levels of corruption that they have been able to sow within the country. So this is something we mentioned back in episode 1 when we were talking about the initial development of organised crime in the country, is that even from the start of their operations, Albanian gangs were infiltrating all levels of the levers of power in Albania. This is particularly true of politics, policing and the judiciary in the country. So local politics and policing is unsurprisingly particularly susceptible to corruption. When you consider that the average monthly wage of a police officer in the country is around about 400 euros, for a senior police officer around about 1400 euros, the high levels of money that Albanian groups are earning and therefore able to spend on corruption, it's not really surprising that policing can be infiltrated in this way. And the same is true for local politics, as we've mentioned. So in our previous episode, we mentioned how a cocaine laboratory that was uncovered in the town of Fieri was owned by the former mayor of the local municipality. And it's not unusual for criminals themselves to enter local politics, such as running for mayor. And if it's not the criminals themselves who are running for office, it's not uncommon for them to have a close relationship with the mayors of particular municipalities or cities and towns. So the mayor of Durrës, for example, was recorded in 2019, recorded having a phone conversation with a man who'd been arrested for drug trafficking. But it's not just local politics where we see corruption. So in our previous episode, we mentioned a man by the name of Fatih Doughty, who'd been given an exclusion notice from the UK by the Home Office because of his high-level involvement in the cocaine trade in the country. Now, in a recent video of the supporters of Sali Berisha, the former Prime Minister of Albania, he's filmed kicking in the door of the offices of the Democratic Party and taking part in this protest with the supporters of the former Prime Minister. Sali Berisha himself is a designated individual by the United States due to significant corruption that dates back to his time as Prime Minister. The current Prime Minister himself, Edi Rama, has been accused of being involved in corruption. He has reportedly given 3.4 million euros in state tenders to some of the individuals who have been linked to the Mexican cartels. And in October 2020, he met with two of these individuals, one of whom is alleged to be involved in the money laundering of the Sinaloa cartel, and another who owns a tourist resort in Albania, which is again alleged to be a front used to launder money for Mexican cartels. Now, this is something that Edi Rama has been challenged about on Albanian TV, and it's something that he strenuously denies. In February 2022, the former Minister of the Interior, Saimir Tahiri, was sentenced to 3 years in jail for his alleged links to a drug trafficking group which involved two of his relatives. And in late December 2022, a government official, Arisa Ferro, was caught on the North Macedonian border attempting to smuggle cannabis into the country, and reportedly used her government ID to smuggle drugs through border checkpoints. Reportedly, her romantic partner was also arrested for drug trafficking at the same time. In general, funding for political groups often comes from anonymous donors. Now, this is a way in which organised crime groups can both launder their money, as no questions are asked where it comes from, and buy political influence too. It can also help secure public contracts, which can then be turned into property developments, which again you can then use to launder your money. And there are also reports that political groups have relationships with organised crime groups who they use to secure votes, either through buying or intimidating voters. So this can all combine to lead to limited political will to actually tackle organised crime, as many of these political groups are benefiting from their relationship with organised crime. And corruption within the judiciary is also a long-term problem too. So a 2022 Balkan Insight report highlighted how Albanian judges were under scrutiny for bending the rules to give prisoners early release. And this includes those serving life sentences. And this issue is also fairly complex because some of these rulings are based on the recommendations of parole officers and prison officers who themselves are susceptible to corruption. And this makes the conviction of serious organised crime hard to achieve, and even when conviction is achieved, having criminals serve their full term is also pretty difficult because of the way in which they are able to corrupt the judiciary. Now, attempts have been made to improve this. So in 2016, Albania formed a specialised structure for anti-corruption and organised crime, or SPAK, or SPAC. This is an independent judicial body that investigates organised crime and corruption in the country, especially within government and the highest levels of society. And it began operating in early December 2019. But it's not just in Albania where Albanian organised crime is able to sow corruption. So they're also able to exploit corruption in their operations in Latin America too. So in February 2023, in Ecuador, the Gran Padrino scandal hit the news when digital outlet La Posta reported on a shelved investigation that links the brother-in-law of Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso with Albanian organised crime. So Guillermo Lasso's brother-in-law, Danilo Carrera, and his close friend, a businessman by the name of Ruben Cherez, both implicated in a corruption scandal known as the Encuentro case. Now, this is a bribery and corruption scandal linked to the appointing of officials to publicly owned energy companies. The Gran Padrino scandal names Ruben Cherez as being part of an alleged active network with direct ties to Albanian organised crime. Cherez is reportedly a business partner of a man by the name of Dritan Gjika, who is accused of being a member of an active Albanian organised crime group who were involved in drug trafficking in Ecuador. Now, this report on the Gran Padrino case had reportedly been shown to Lasso himself, and shortly afterwards the investigation was shelved. So following the leak of this report by La Posta, a 7-person cross-party commission was set up to investigate the scandal. Now, one of the members of this commission, a legislator by the name of Viviana Veloz, has stated that she's been the subject of death threats from Albanian criminals as a result of investigating this corruption scandal. Now, on the 1st of March, this commission recommended the impeachment of President Lasso. We also mentioned the corruption of the judiciary in Albania, and again, Albanian criminals have been able to exploit corruption within the judiciary in Latin America too. And Plan V, as we mentioned, an Ecuadorian outlet, in fact says that there are only, in 2020 at least, only 4 Balkan criminals in Ecuador's jails, 3 of them Serbian and 1 Albanian, and that's Dritan Rejepi, who, as we've covered, was able to develop the largest Albanian-speaking cocaine trafficking network in the world from his prison cell in Ecuador. And reportedly, when he first went to jail, at least according to a report from Albanian outlet A2, he might not have been a particularly high-level member of organised crime. And that's simply because those that are generally able to pay their way out of even being sent to jail. But the thing is, Dritan Rejepi himself is now no longer in prison. So despite being the leader of the largest Albanian-speaking drug trafficking network in the world, despite being wanted for extradition by Albania, Italy, and Belgium for a double homicide, for violent burglary, and for involvement in drug trafficking. And despite having only served 7 years of his 13-year term in Ecuador, he was granted pre-release bail in November 2021 and ordered to present himself to court once a month while he served the rest of his sentence in a luxury apartment complex in Ecuador. And Rjepi has not been seen or heard from since January 2022. So again, you can see the ways in which they've exploited corruption, not just in Albania, but in Latin America. And this brings us to Europe. Now, Europe, of course, has stronger social institutions than countries such as Ecuador or Albania, but we shouldn't be naive and think that organised crime groups aren't able to exploit corruption in our part of the world as well. Corruption in Europe's ports is clearly a significant issue. A report from The Economist quoted Albanian journalist Artan Hoxha, who states that around about 25% of the revenue from every cocaine shipment organised by Albanian criminals goes directly towards funding corruption. It's seen as a business expense. Methods such as the rip-on, rip-off method in order to extract cocaine requires the cooperation of those who work in the port. And when a port official can earn around 50,000 euros for moving a single shipping container, or for providing tip-offs on which containers have been identified as high risk, then you can see why it's so easy to corrupt people working in these ports. And of course, just as in Albania and in Ecuador, policing, politics, customs, and the judiciary are also prime targets for corruption by Albanian groups. But corruption is pervasive, and it doesn't just affect one aspect of society. All of Europe's institutions can be impacted by it. So we mentioned how corruption in Albania and therefore the high levels of money laundering within the property market have led to spiraling housing prices, which therefore affect everyday members of society. Corrupt officials granting public tenders to members of organised crime groups rather than an open and fair competition impacts on business operations. Similarly, businesses who are unable to secure real estate within city centres because that property is, despite sitting empty, is being used as a front for money laundering, again impacts on businesses. And we've even seen Albanian and Italian groups cooperate to defraud the Italian healthcare system. So there are a number of different ways in which organised crime can sow corruption, not just in more vulnerable countries such as Albania and Ecuador, but within more developed countries with stronger social institutions as well. And with the amount of money involved and being earned by these networks, it's almost inevitable that there will be certain individuals who will be susceptible to being corrupted. There have even been reports of a bailiff in Belgium, for example, who was arrested because they were acting on behalf of an organised crime network to access national financial records so that these gangs could identify members of the police, members of politics, members of the judiciary who were in debt or had particular financial problems. So Albanian networks will use the money that they earn from their illicit trades, as well as sexual favours from the women they control in their sex trafficking networks, to corrupt public officials or port workers, whoever. They also use threats and intimidation in order to coerce people into working with them. It's not just Albanian organised crime groups, of course. The EMCDDA in 2021 reported that around 60% of organised crime networks operating in Europe engaged in corruption. The Albanian Mafia has been able to establish itself among the leading players in transnational organised crime in Europe, but it's been able to do that through the trafficking of cocaine, through the trafficking of marijuana, through the trafficking of people, and maintain its power through strategic use of violence, sowing corruption, and taking advantage of their home country of Albania as well as elsewhere in the world, to launder not just their money, but the money of their network of criminal contacts as well. But what comes next for Albanian organised crime? For so long able to operate in the shadows and maintain a low profile, Albanian organised crime has found itself more and more in the spotlight, whether it's through their trafficking of drugs or through the attention they received through their human trafficking, for instance, in the small boat crossings that they carried out into the UK. We're seeing record drug seizures, we're seeing arrests of hundreds of people at a time from Albanian-speaking networks. So is this having any impact on them? That's what we're going to look at in our final episode of this video series. We'll cover particular law enforcement operations and certain tactics that have had success. We'll also look at other threats that might impact our operations, but we'll also look at potential opportunities that Albanian organised crime groups might be able to take advantage of, and whether they might actually grow even more powerful in the coming years.